In the corridors of European palaces, where the weight of lineage and legacy pressed heavily upon every decision, the lives of royal children were anything but ordinary. These young heirs were expected to embody the aspirations of dynasties, to carry the hopes of generations, and to perform their roles in an intricate dance of politics, diplomacy, and social expectation. Yet, amid the gilded halls and ceremonious rituals, there existed a tragic undercurrent, an often overlooked reality for children who were born with Down syndrome. In a world that revered perfection and continuity of bloodlines, these children frequently faced a harsh and unforgiving fate. Their lives, though enveloped in wealth and privilege, were shaped by societal prejudices, fear, and an unyielding demand for conformity. During the Renaissance and into the early modern period, royal households were not only symbols of power, but also models of human perfection. Monarchs were seen as representatives of divine order, and their offspring were expected to mirror this ideal. Any deviation from this expectation, physical or cognitive, was often perceived as a blemish upon the family's honor. For children with Down syndrome, this perception could determine the trajectory of their entire lives. In many cases, they were hidden from public view, confined within the private quarters of palaces, and denied the public recognition and education afforded to their siblings. Despite their royal blood, they were often treated as burdens, and their potential for joy, creativity, and contribution was stifled by fear and misunderstanding. Medical knowledge in the early periods was rudimentary at best. Conditions like Down syndrome were not understood scientifically. They were interpreted through a lens of superstition, religious morality, or crude speculation. Some believed that these children were cursed, others thought them divine tests, and a few saw them as pitiable anomalies. In the royal context, this lack of understanding was amplified by political concerns. A monarch's lineage needed to produce heirs capable of securing alliances, claiming territories, and maintaining stability. A child who did not fit the prescribed mold of physical and mental aptitude was, in many eyes, a liability. Some royal families, out of love or guilt, tried to shield these children from the harshest scrutiny, yet even within the relative safety of palace walls, their futures were uncertain and fraught with limitations. One striking example comes from the courts of France during the late 17th century. Reports from the period describe the life of a young prince born with clear signs of Down syndrome. While historians debate the specifics, archival records indicate that he was initially given the care and attention expected for a royal child. Tutors were assigned, attendants prepared elaborate playrooms, and the court physicians monitored his health meticulously. Yet, as the boy grew, it became evident that he would not be able to fulfill the rigorous expectations imposed on heirs of his stature. His parents, torn between affection and duty, made the difficult decision to seclude him from public appearances. The prince lived much of his life within the confines of palace chambers, receiving limited education and minimal engagement with the outside world. While he was never subjected to neglect in the sense of deprivation of food or clothing, the deprivation of opportunity, the denial of social participation, the lack of meaningful roles, cast a long shadow over his existence. Across the continent, in the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, similar narratives unfolded. A young archduke, described in surviving letters as gentle and perceptive, faced relentless pressure due to his developmental differences. Courtiers, driven by both fear of scandal and genuine misunderstanding, often treated him with condescension. His parents, however, struggled with their own moral compass and the political ramifications of their child's condition. They employed tutors, musicians, and artists to stimulate his mind and provide amusement, but the structural limitations of the era meant that he could never fully integrate into the duties of princely life. Festivals, formal ceremonies, and courtly dances were carefully orchestrated to exclude him, ostensibly for his safety and propriety, yet this isolation reinforced a sense of separation and marginalization. The tragedies endured by these royal children were not solely emotional. Many were subject to medical interventions that, by modern standards, would be considered experimental or even cruel. Palaces employed physicians who attempted a variety of treatments to correct perceived deficiencies: herbal remedies, physical exercises, and in some instances, invasive procedures that caused pain and discomfort without improving quality of life. The philosophy of care was often rooted in the belief that a child's difference could and should be remedied, rather than embraced as a natural aspect of humanity. As a result, many children endured repeated examinations, therapies, and interventions which, while sometimes well-intentioned, contributed to a sense of vulnerability and distress. Social isolation was another profound factor shaping their lives. Whereas a typical prince or princess would receive visitors, participate in educational circles, and witness the governance of realms firsthand, children with Down syndrome were often confined to domestic spaces, interacting with a narrow circle of attendants. Play, learning, and socialization were heavily curated and controlled, limiting spontaneity and self-expression. The psychological impact of this isolation is difficult to measure, but historical letters and memoirs suggest feelings of loneliness and frustration. Some children developed close attachments to their caretakers or siblings, yet these bonds could not entirely mitigate the sense of exclusion imposed by societal expectations. In addition to social and medical challenges, there existed a pervasive fear of inheritance and succession crises. Monarchies were inherently fragile, dependent upon clear lines of succession. A child with developmental differences, even if loved and nurtured, was unlikely to be considered a viable heir. This pragmatic, albeit cold, reality meant that royal parents had to make decisions balancing affection with dynastic survival. In some instances, arrangements were made for lifelong guardianship under trusted relatives or attendants. In others, the children were quietly removed from records and public consciousness, their existence acknowledged only within private circles. These decisions, while often guided by compassion or duty, contributed to a quiet erasure of identity and opportunity. Among the historical records that survive, a few vivid accounts offer glimpses into the daily lives and struggles of royal children with Down syndrome. One such story emerges from the court of Spain in the late 16th century. A young infante, born into the Habsburg dynasty, exhibited physical and cognitive traits consistent with what we now recognize as Down syndrome. Contemporary chronicles note that his appearance, particularly the characteristic facial features, caused a mixture of curiosity and unease within the court. While his parents reportedly treated him with tenderness, the political realities of dynastic succession cast a long and inescapable shadow over his upbringing. He was kept largely within private apartments, shielded from the formal functions that defined royal life, and interactions with other members of the nobility were carefully monitored to avoid public embarrassment. Nevertheless, he formed deep bonds with select attendants, often showing remarkable memory and an innate sense of empathy toward those who cared for him. These small islands of connection offered some solace in a life otherwise constrained by societal expectations. In England, during the 17th century, another royal child faced a comparable trajectory. This young prince, whose presence is recorded in letters between courtiers and physicians, was described as gentle, bright-eyed, yet limited in his understanding of matters of state. His parents, a king and queen deeply invested in the appearance of dynastic stability, struggled to reconcile their affection with the demands of monarchy. Tutors were brought in to provide instruction, not in statecraft or diplomacy, but in music, art, and other pursuits considered suitable for a child of limited capacity to participate in governance. Court entertainments were adapted to include him in minor roles, yet he remained at a remove from public ceremonies, banquets, and political assemblies. Observers from the time noted both the care with which he was treated and the silent sorrow that accompanied his isolation, suggesting an acute awareness of the limitations imposed upon him by birth and circumstance. In some courts, the treatment of children with Down syndrome reflected a combination of fear, superstition, and genuine concern. Medical practitioners often oscillated between benign neglect and intrusive intervention. In the German principalities, one archducal family documented a series of experimental therapies intended to stimulate mental faculties. These included early forms of structured play, lessons in music, and physical exercises designed to encourage coordination and focus. While some children seemed to enjoy these activities, the underlying motive was rarely the development of personal potential. Rather, it was an attempt to produce a child more acceptable to the expectations of society. In cases where progress appeared limited, frustration among caretakers and family members could result in withdrawal of attention, deepening the child's sense of invisibility within the household. The social dynamics within royal courts were particularly unforgiving. The presence of a child who could not fully participate in the rituals of courtly life often created discomfort among nobility. Courtiers invested in appearances and alliances could be subtly or overtly dismissive, treating the child as an object of pity or curiosity. In some instances, the child's siblings were encouraged to avoid extended interaction, a cruel reflection of the fear that exposure could compromise familial prestige. Yet despite these constraints, many children displayed remarkable resilience. Letters and diaries from attendants reveal that some developed keen observational skills, emotional sensitivity, and a capacity for affection that transcended the narrow confines imposed upon them. Their intelligence, though measured differently from their typically developing peers, manifested in emotional depth, artistic inclination, and an intuitive understanding of human behavior. One of the more poignant aspects of these lives was the way in which royal parents navigated the tension between love and duty. Some monarchs sought to provide as much enrichment as possible within the constraints of societal expectation, commissioning private tutors, musicians, and artists. Others, however, succumbed to political pressure, prioritizing lineage and succession over the personal happiness of their child. In these cases, children could be relegated to separate quarters for the entirety of their lives, their existence acknowledged only in passing records or private correspondences. The psychological toll of such arrangements is difficult to quantify, yet the historical record suggests that these children were often aware of their difference, experiencing both the warmth of familial affection and the pain of social exclusion. In France, during the reign of Louis XIV, the plight of a royal child with Down syndrome illustrates the intersection of power, image, and empathy. The boy, the son of a prominent noble family, was reportedly cherished by his parents, yet simultaneously sequestered from the public eye. Palace officials were instructed to ensure that visitors did not see him to prevent gossip or scandal. At the same time, he was provided with an elaborate private environment, including miniature furnishings, musical instruments, and attendants who attended to his personal and educational needs. Despite these accommodations, the child's lack of opportunity to engage in typical social or ceremonial activities meant that his development was constrained in subtle but significant ways. He exhibited moments of joy, laughter, and creativity, yet his world remained circumscribed, defined more by protection and concealment than by freedom or recognition. These stories, repeated across Europe, reveal a pattern of both care and confinement, affection and restriction. The children themselves, often misunderstood, developed unique forms of resilience, forging deep connections with the few who entered their private spheres. Yet their lives were undeniably shaped by the rigid demands of monarchy, the unyielding expectations of succession, and the pervasive stigmas surrounding cognitive differences. In reflecting upon their experiences, one is struck by the paradox of royal life. Abundance in material resources contrasted with profound limitations in personal freedom, opportunity, and social recognition. As these children grew older, the constraints imposed by royal expectation became increasingly pronounced. Childhood, often a time of exploration, social learning, and imaginative play, was for them overshadowed by a life structured around containment and careful oversight. In many cases, the transition from infancy to adolescence was marked not by rites of passage or public recognition, but by a continuation of seclusion and protective supervision. Courtiers and attendants meticulously controlled their movements, interactions, and even the simplest forms of recreation, ensuring that every aspect of their existence conformed to societal norms, or more accurately, that it did not violate them. The palace, which for other children might have represented a world of opportunity and influence, instead became a gilded cage, offering comfort in material terms, but restricting freedom in nearly every other sense. Isolation, however, was not purely physical. Emotional and social isolation weighed heavily as well. Siblings and cousins, often themselves acutely aware of the political and social stakes of royal life, were sometimes instructed to limit contact, either to prevent embarrassment or to maintain appearances. Visitors and dignitaries were kept at a distance, their interactions filtered through layers of supervision. Even affectionate interactions with parents could be tinged with the anxiety and disappointment that many royals felt, torn between genuine love and the pressures of dynastic responsibility. The children, perceptive in ways that many adults underestimated, were often aware of this tension. They experienced the warmth of attention and the sting of absence simultaneously, forming complex emotional landscapes shaped by both care and neglect. In the courts of Italy during the Renaissance, one young nobleman, described in contemporary letters as alert and engaging yet ever constrained, spent his adolescence in carefully structured seclusion. His parents, concerned with both his well-being and the reputation of their family, organized educational and artistic programs within the private quarters of the palace. Music, poetry, and painting were introduced not simply for enjoyment, but as a means of cultivating a sense of achievement within the narrow confines permitted. While these efforts were undoubtedly beneficial in providing intellectual and emotional stimulation, they could not substitute for the social interactions, responsibilities, and recognition typically afforded to other heirs. The boy's life, though materially comfortable, was marked by the quiet sorrow of exclusion from the broader community of his peers. Another recurring theme in historical accounts is the impact of courtly surveillance and scrutiny. The presence of a royal child with Down syndrome was often treated as a potential embarrassment, a deviation from the idealized image of a flawless lineage. Consequently, every gesture, every display of behavior was observed and interpreted through a lens of caution and anxiety. In some instances, attendants became gatekeepers, mediating the child's access to both family and the outside world. While this supervision was framed as protection, it also reinforced a sense of otherness and separation. Children internalized these subtle signals, developing awareness of the limitations imposed upon them not only by circumstance, but by the expectations and perceptions of those around them. In the courts of the British Isles, particularly during the Stuart period, historical records describe similar dynamics. One young princess, exhibiting traits consistent with Down syndrome, was kept largely out of public view, though her intellectual and artistic abilities were nurtured in private. She participated in music lessons and creative exercises, demonstrating sensitivity and an acute understanding of interpersonal dynamics. Yet, her interactions with the broader court were minimal, and she was rarely included in ceremonial occasions or family portraits. Letters from attendants and tutors suggest that she experienced profound frustration at these restrictions, oscillating between joy in moments of engagement and despair at her social marginalization. Her story underscores the duality faced by many royal children: material security and emotional care on one hand, profound limitation and social isolation on the other. Medical practices during adolescence continued to reflect both hope and misunderstanding. Physicians and tutors experimented with various methods intended to enhance cognitive function, physical coordination, and social adaptability. Some interventions were gentle and constructive, while others, guided by misconceptions about ability and normalcy, could be invasive or stressful. The children's daily routines were often regimented to a degree that left little room for spontaneous exploration or self-directed learning. Their experiences highlight a fundamental tension: the desire of families to provide opportunity and enrichment, constrained by societal expectations that prioritized conformity and outward appearance above individual development. Romantic and social prospects were virtually non-existent for most of these children. In societies where marriage was both a personal and political arrangement, a royal child with Down syndrome was unlikely to be considered a viable partner. This reality extended their isolation into adulthood, reinforcing a lifetime of limited social engagement. Some were integrated into courtly life in controlled ways, such as participating in private gatherings or artistic salons, yet these instances were exceptions rather than the rule. The psychological impact of this prolonged exclusion, while difficult to quantify, was undoubtedly significant. Historians and psychologists studying these narratives note that many children developed heightened emotional awareness, empathy, and attachment to specific caretakers, reflecting resilience and adaptive coping mechanisms even under restrictive conditions. Ultimately, the lives of these royal children illuminate a profound paradox. They were surrounded by material abundance and access to cultural enrichment, yet denied the fundamental human experiences of autonomy, social integration, and public recognition. Their stories are reminders that privilege, when bound by rigid societal expectations and ignorance, can become a cage rather than a sanctuary. They also challenge modern assumptions about historical care, revealing that love and protection, while present, were often inseparable from the constraints of appearance, duty, and fear of societal judgment. As these royal children entered young adulthood, the cumulative effects of seclusion, careful supervision, and societal expectation became increasingly evident. Unlike their siblings, who might assume political offices, lead armies, or participate in dynastic marriages, these young adults often remained within the private sphere of the palace. Their lives, though materially secure, were circumscribed by the same forces that had defined their childhood: the tension between love and duty, the unyielding expectations of lineage, and the pervasive stigma surrounding cognitive differences. Many were cared for by a devoted circle of attendants, physicians, and relatives, yet even this network could not fully mitigate the sense of marginalization imposed by a society that measured worth by political utility and social conformity. Historical records reveal a range of experiences. In the Austrian Habsburg courts, one archduke with Down syndrome was allowed to remain in the family's private apartments, participating in limited courtly functions and receiving continual attention from tutors and musicians. His intelligence, expressed through artistic endeavors and emotional insight, earned him the affection of caretakers and occasional admiration from visitors. Yet he remained excluded from succession considerations, public ceremonies, and the broader responsibilities of nobility. The isolation, though gentle in its administration, reinforced the reality that his existence was tolerated rather than celebrated within the official structures of power. In France, similar patterns emerged. A young nobleman, described as charming, attentive, yet restricted, lived in an environment carefully curated to balance care with concealment. He engaged in music, painting, and literary exercises, demonstrating sensitivity and creativity. However, the court's obsession with image and lineage meant that public appearances were minimized and opportunities for meaningful participation in state affairs were non-existent. Letters from attendants and contemporaneous chroniclers convey a dual reality: one of affection, amusement, and occasional triumph within the private sphere, contrasted starkly by exclusion and invisibility in the public realm. These experiences highlight the paradox of their existence: privileged yet constrained, cared for yet socially marginalized. Medical and educational practices continued to evolve, reflecting both genuine concern and lingering misconceptions. Physicians often attempted to enhance cognitive development through structured exercises, dietary regimens, and, in some instances, experimental treatments. Tutors sought to cultivate skills in music, art, and language, aiming to provide engagement and accomplishment even when traditional academic or political pursuits were impractical. While these interventions could enrich daily life, they were ultimately constrained by the societal imperative to maintain appearances and protect the family's reputation. The children's agency remained limited, their lives shaped more by the expectations of others than by personal choice. Social relationships remained tightly controlled. Romantic prospects, as noted earlier, were nearly non-existent due to the dynastic functions of marriage. Friendships outside the immediate circle of caretakers were rare, and interactions with siblings, while sometimes affectionate, were often mediated by protocol or concern for propriety. In some cases, children formed deep emotional attachments to specific attendants or tutors, relationships characterized by loyalty, mutual understanding, and rare moments of unguarded expression. These bonds, though limited in scope, provided a form of emotional sustenance and continuity across the years. Despite these constraints, many of these royal adults exhibited resilience, adaptability, and remarkable sensitivity. Accounts describe moments of joy, creativity, and insight that transcend the limitations imposed upon them. Their presence could soften the rigidity of courtly life, inspiring compassion among attendants and family members. Yet the broader societal structures rarely acknowledge these qualities, valuing political and social utility above personal merit. Consequently, the historical legacy of these individuals is often faint, recorded primarily in private letters, anecdotal accounts, and occasional portraits, rather than in the chronicles of power or public achievement. In reflecting on the lives of these royal children, one observes the complex interplay between privilege and limitation. Their material comfort, education, and protection were undeniable. Yet these advantages could not fully compensate for the social isolation, constrained autonomy, and lack of recognition they endured. Their experiences illuminate broader themes about human worth, societal expectation, and the consequences of rigid hierarchical structures. They also challenge modern readers to consider the nuanced realities of historical care. Acts of love and protection were inextricably entwined with exclusion, concealment, and the prioritization of political image over personal fulfillment. Finally, the historical records prompt reflection on the ways in which these children shaped, in subtle but significant ways, the emotional and cultural landscapes of their courts. Through their presence, their personalities, and their resilience, they influenced the attitudes of caretakers, siblings, and even monarchs, fostering moments of empathy, creativity, and reflection. Although they rarely assumed formal roles in governance or succession, their lives were far from inconsequential. They remind us that human impact is not solely measured by public achievement or political authority, but also by the quieter, often invisible ways in which individuals touch the lives of those around them. The legacies of these royal children with Down syndrome extend beyond their confined lives and limited social roles. Though often excluded from political power and dynastic succession, their presence in royal households left indelible marks on the emotional and cultural fabric of the court. Attendants, tutors, and family members who devoted themselves to their care frequently reflected on the unique qualities these children exhibited: emotional intelligence, empathy, and a capacity for joy and connection that transcended societal expectations. In some ways, these qualities softened the rigid protocols and often harsh hierarchies of palace life, creating small, intimate spaces where human affection and creativity could flourish despite the constraints imposed by lineage and social scrutiny. From a historical perspective, the treatment of royal children with Down syndrome highlights the intersection of privilege and vulnerability. While they enjoyed material security and access to education and culture, these advantages were inseparable from systemic limitations. The very structures that protected their physical well-being simultaneously restricted their personal freedom, autonomy, and opportunities for social engagement. This paradox offers a nuanced understanding of privilege. It is not merely a matter of wealth or status, but also of the extent to which one is permitted to participate fully in the world. The royal children's experiences illustrate how societal expectations can shape and often constrain human potential, regardless of material circumstance. The psychological and emotional impact of these constrained lives is apparent in the historical records. Diaries, letters, and memoirs reveal moments of joy and accomplishment interwoven with isolation and exclusion. Many of these children developed remarkable resilience and emotional depth, qualities that allowed them to navigate the narrow spheres in which they were permitted to operate. Their stories challenge assumptions about historical care, demonstrating that love, protection, and attention, though genuine, were frequently coupled with limitations imposed by fear, social stigma, and dynastic necessity. The tension between affection and restriction defined their lives, producing complex emotional landscapes that historians and psychologists continue to study and interpret. Moreover, the existence of these children challenges modern perceptions of history and lineage. Histories of royal families often emphasize political achievements, battles, and dynastic continuity, yet the quieter narratives of marginalized or overlooked family members offer a more complete understanding of the human experience within these power structures. The lives of children with Down syndrome reveal the human cost of rigid social hierarchies, highlighting the tension between personal value and social expectation. They remind us that history is not only composed of grand events and prominent figures, but also of those whose lives were shaped by care, love, and constraint in equal measure. In contemporary terms, reflecting on the experiences of these royal children invites empathy and reconsideration of how societies perceive and accommodate difference. While modern understanding of Down syndrome and other cognitive or developmental conditions has evolved dramatically, the historical narrative underscores persistent themes: marginalization, societal expectation, and the struggle for recognition. By examining the lives of these children, we gain insight into the ways in which culture, status, and perception shape human experience, and how resilience and dignity can emerge even under restrictive conditions. Their stories encourage modern audiences to value emotional intelligence, compassion, and human connection alongside traditional measures of success and achievement. Finally, the memory of these royal children serves as both a cautionary tale and a source of inspiration. Their lives illustrate the consequences of rigid social structures and the perils of valuing individuals solely for their utility, while also demonstrating the capacity for human resilience, empathy, and emotional richness, even when constrained. Although their names may not dominate history books, and their faces may not adorn grand portraits, their presence shaped the private worlds of royal courts and left subtle yet enduring imprints on those who cared for them. In acknowledging their stories, we honor both their struggles and their quiet triumphs, and we are reminded that the measure of a life is not determined solely by power or prestige, but also by the depth of experience, the capacity for connection, and the resilience of the human spirit.